afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. So I'm Ruo-Fan, and this is our third colloquium series on social problem and inequality in Taiwan and beyond. And we have two following talks, so welcome to join us. So you might, in other occasions, you might see me as a moderator, but today is my first time sharing my work with all of you. And this talk is entitled When the Rules of the Game Change, Culture Guide, Bridgework, and Uncertainty in Taiwanese University Admissions. Since we have a small group, so I want to understand a little bit about your college admission experiences. So if you ever apply to college like outside of the US, like Japan, Korea, China, and Taiwan, please raise your hand. Only one? Only, yeah. Okay, so if you have ever applied to the universities in the US, including Stanford, Harvard, or whatever universities in the US, please raise your hand. Including all schools in the US. Okay, so we get a mixture of the audiences who have the combination of college admission experiences. So one final question. If you ever, in this process, if you ever have the people who help you during the college admissions, either they help you read your essays, edit your essays, or practice, or whatever things they help you, raise your hand. Really? Really? No? Okay. So, okay. Okay, so today I'm going to tell a story not about the student themselves alone, but about those hidden heroes and the supporters who help them along the way to get college admission offers under conditions of the shifting meritocracy in Taiwan. Okay, so let's get it started. So we've seen a growing trend in East Asia countries to move away from this super intense exam center admissions to what we call a dual merit system. So Japan first led the way by adopting holistic admissions, and Korea and Taiwan soon followed. And with this trend to Americanize college admissions in these East Asia systems, it actually changes a lot of rules and admission criteria and process in the Taiwan's education system. So in Taiwan, we've seen these shifting rules of the game in Taiwan has significantly reshaped what meritocracy look like, what we define merits, how merit is measured at the same time, like how we screen students and identify talent, especially in the college admission process. And in this process, previously Taiwanese students, they only rely on high test scores like students from China to get into a really good college. But right now, after this reform, Taiwanese students not only have to get a really high test scores, now they have to submit their application essays to different departments, because in Taiwan, high schoolers, they apply to a college and major jointly rather than claiming a major after, like the US system. And it's even more intense in Taiwan, which is the new rules kind of empower a group of professors from different departments to interview those undergrad candidates to decide whom to send out an offer. So as these shifting rules of the game really not only redefine what is merit, what is cultural capital, who is likely to activate that capital, and who is likely to receive admissions, it brings a lot of uncertainties for people who involve in this playing field. So this is a quote I got in 2019, and a middle-class student, a pretty privileged student, when I was conducting field work, these students asked me, She looked at the brochures and she looked at the college website and she asked me, look very puzzling, and she said, well, this university, she was applying to an interdisciplinary major, and she said, the university want interdisciplinary students, but what counts as interdisciplinary? How do we present ourselves as a good fit for an interdisciplinary major? So this brings to the questions I'm going to pose today is when those criteria remain ambivalent and kind of shifting, when students, even those privileged students, they are start guessing like what exactly do gatekeepers want, what do professors want, how do teachers serve the role of somewhere in between to translate those ambiguous expectations into instructions when the criteria shift. And how do teachers really figure out what universities want and then decode those expectations to tell students what you should do in packaging their applications? And how does this labor vary across different student groups, including the privileged, the underprivileged, and the underprepared? And the reason that this question is important is if we kind of like step back to think about these ideas or Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. So the previous idea was if you had cultural capital, which defined as high status cultural signals, like you play violin, you visit museum, you can make eye contact, or you have the excellent art and food test, and you just directly translate those high status signals into getting to a good college, right? But Bourdieu is clear that such value is not fixed, but contingent. So the culture has to be, these practices has to be value to be capital. And as universities like start shifting and start redefining what is the rewarding and non-rewarding signals, when these prior practices do not automatically match with the new expectations, what will people do in navigate the process? So one of the example would be, for example, in Taiwan previously, even a lot of privileged students, they are used to get good test scores. But when the rules shift, they have to start reconfigure, okay, now test score is not enough, but what should we do to really get into a good college in this process? But we know little about how people reconfigure their strategies and how people navigate those disruptions to bridge the gap. So the other types of research and the other type of scholars, they talk about this emergent role of cultural guides. So cultural guides are basically people who can decode unspoken rules and norms. And you can think about the super expensive private tutors, or think about school teachers who can help you to even revise your application essays and practice to help those students along the way. But a lot of times, we presume those cultural guides are either gatekeepers themselves or they personally play the game super well. Right, but in Taiwan's context, when those teachers themselves do not necessarily navigate the new systems by themselves, at the same time, they are also not professors who have power to decide whom to send out an offer. When they serve as the translators in this somewhere in between to try to match students with different universities, what do they actually do? And can there be any loss in translation in the process? So to understand how teachers intervention and what teachers do and teachers coaching, I select a selective high school in Taiwan with a diverse student body. And I sampled 20 middle class and 22 working class. And I define middle class as one of their parents having a college degree. And I try to understand what teachers do. So I interviewed 35 teachers and alumni who participate in college guidance. So unlike other studies who either rely on college admission essays or retrospectively interview students after they get admission offers, what I did is a very intense follow-up. And these include, I follow 42 middle class and working class students starting from the beginning to the end. I conducted waves of interviews to understand students' decision-making in the process. I collect students' application essays because in Taiwan, it's quite common students will apply to different majors, like they may apply to econ or they may apply to engineering school in college. So I try to understand how they tailor their narratives to different departments. And I also attend the 35 mock oral interviews that happening in school. And this is a very unique phenomenon I found in Taiwan, which is high school teachers, they will organize mock oral interview. And those teachers, they will role play professors to try to imitate what would happen in the on-site setting to help students practice how to answer professors' questions before those students even come to campus interviews phoned by professors. And then I trace admission outcomes. So in this talk, I will focus on the signals that students are advised to amplify, omit, and modify before they present themselves in front of the gatekeepers. Okay, so the biggest takeaway here, how do teachers help students translate their individual traits into favorable signals under the conditions of shifting marines? So I found that teachers conduct Bridgework, a very intense cultural labor to translate their individual traits into favorable signals. So it's not like it's like these teachers, they are trying to figure out what professors want. And they are trying to guess what professors might favor. And they are translating those expectations to match and fine-tune students' applications to match with what an art professor or a law professor will want to see. And such work is not only labor intensive, it also varies based on students' background. So Bridgework entails 3 logic: selling class, selling disadvantage, and selling potential. So let me walk you through how Bridgework actually looks like at Woodstone High, the schools I study. So this is a picture on the left side. This is a picture I took at Woodstone High. So you can see a whole row of college admission essays hanging on cliffs. So these are the real college admission essays wrote by previous alumni. So it's like, I was quite surprised when I see these pictures. It's like you enter into your closet and you have the pens and the clothes or whatever things clothes you want to wear. And depending on which university and which department you want to apply, just selectively pick it and wear it up or something like that. So on the left side, these are the brochures on the bookshelves that teachers collect. And basically, the alumni, as they enter, after they finish the interviews, they will get a survey or the questions. And then those alumni, they just memorize the questions they got asked by professors. And then teachers collect those materials. So these are 2, and at the same time, Hui Mei, an experienced counselor, she told me she just organized 84 mock oral interviews to help 200 students who will go to the campus visit to help students figure out, go through this screening process. So one thing interesting from these 2 pictures is that on the one hand, Bridgework is really a labor-intense process because teachers have to collect so many things. On the other hand, Bridgework is the cultural outsourcing. organized by school, because those teachers are skilled at boosting students' test scores, but they are not really skilled at exposing students to diverse areas of self-representation. So this is the ways teachers try to activate the alumni pools to outsource cultural guidance to help their current students. So how does this Bridgework actually work? So the first logic is what I call selling class. Selling class refers to how teachers advise middle-class students who have sufficient cultural signals, such as extracurricular activity, ballet dancing, and study abroad experiences, to refine their class markers into disciplinary signals. So it's a little bit different compared to the US. It's not like you are saying that you can just say you are from a wealthy family, or it's not like legacy admissions. You just say your parents or your relatives are also from Stanford or Harvard or something. And in this process, it's like you have to transform those privilege into the disciplinary signals to adjust to fit with what an art professor or a law professor would want to see. So let me just give you an example here. For example, Ding Yan is a middle-class boy. He was applying to NTU law major, the most prestigious university in Taiwan. And during a mock oral interview, Ding Yan was asked this question by teachers. And what is your legal opinion on Ruo-Fan, a trial sexual abuse case that happens in Korea? And then Ding Yan said, well, I think Ruo-Fan is the biggest trial sexual abuse case, but the thing is privacy. Even though those abusers violate the law, should their identity be revealed? Well, this might reveal a great answer because Ding Yan clearly aligns the examples with the abstract idea. Ding Yan got corrected. So the geographic teacher said, well, this is a great answer, but instead of saying just privacy, you should say instead reframe this term into the principles of proportionality or the principles of legality to better reflect the terminologies used by law professor. So in this process, what teachers are trying to do is teachers are trying to translate Ding Yan's language to fine-tune to more fit with some disciplines and some terminologies used by a particular major. But in other times, selling disadvantage does not only refers to transforming those class markers into disciplinary signals, but refers to downplay the class privilege and class preferences to avoid misleading fit. So for example, Jia Xin is a middle-class girl. She was applying to law and stage design majors. And she was asked these questions about what is your favorite artist? And then Jia Xin said, well, my favorite is Li Xunqi. He designs stages for concerts and art performances. But later on, Jia Xin then revealed her despise toward local art because a lot of times Jia Xin's family study abroad, so she really saying like the global art than local art. And she said, well, I'm not that into traditional and local arts. So some of you are professors, so you may think about, okay, if you are a professor, how would you judge this candidate? But this is just a practice. So the art analyst told Jia Xin, well, Li Xunqi is a great pick because you're selecting an artist that is well known in the field, not just some popular artist that is known by everyone. But instead of being critical about local art, you should say something framing the local as part of the global. That's something art professors often grapple with as they navigate the tension between the two. So I think one of the things Darwin class tries to tell us is a lot of times we think if you are from wealthy family, if you are privileged, you just do class to obtain offers because you have this cultural affinity with professors or gatekeepers, and it's easy for you to get into good college. But basically, the story here is not really like that. Like they really, because one signal favored by a group of professors in Taiwan might be denied by another. So a lot of times they really rely on the intensive labor performed by teachers to turn their class privilege into disciplinary signals to obtain offers. So some of you may start thinking, well, this is a story. You are saying that middle class students, they really need to spend effort to obtain college admissions in Taiwan, but still they are still getting to good college, right? The story is not that different. How about others? So the second logic I found in Bridgework is what I call silent disadvantage. So silent disadvantage refers to how teachers advise working class and minorities to highlight their adversity as strengths toward particular disciplines, but at the same time covering up the style of talking and style of writing to avoid triggering negative biases in college admissions. So let me give you an example. So I met Xin. Xin is an indigenous working class girl, and I met her a week later when I entered into my field site. And Xin was so excited, and she showed me the first version of her college admission essays. And she called herself a fairy volunteer who returned to the tribe. She's trying to apply to social work and public administrative major. And she wrote this something like that. I was filled with sadness when I saw the old people who cannot move. And she's trying to craft this as a motivation to apply to social work major. And a couple of days later, she looks down and she finds me again. And she showed me the second versions of her application essay with a lot of corrections and a lot of repent remarks done by her teachers. And her literature teacher told Xin, you need to highlight your indigenous backgrounds. That's great. So that you can show you are from the communities that you will be going to serve if you apply to social work or public administrative major. But at the same time, you should downplay your emotional tone. So this literature teacher told Xin, instead of saying you are filled with sadness, you should say something like, this experience made me start wondering how we might redistribute resources in a more structural tone and more analytical tone. I think the tricky part here teachers are trying to do is teachers are trying to tell those working class and minority students to be working class and minority on paper to amplify the adversity to make them cry. Yet on the other hand, the things teachers are trying to do here is also to tell them not sounds like working class and minority by modifying their styles of writing to avoid triggering negative stereotype and negative biases. So a lot of times these negotiations that happens even prior to college admissions screenings is very, very tricky because on the one hand, the adversities that these working class students are told to sell is exactly reflect the nature of behaviors that are told that is not valuable enough and needs to be covered up. So I'll just give you another example about Hong. Hong is a working class student athlete. He is very skilled in rowing, and he entered into the mock oral interview room with his full upper body of muscle. Because he is a rowing athlete, so it's only upper body, not like a leg or something. And then he was very, very nervous because he never been to this interview setting before. And he sit in the chair and he kind of looked down with his hands shaking on his knees. He looked down, he did not make eye contact. And Hong got these questions by his teachers who role play professors. And then the teacher asked Hong, well, you are team leaders in your rowing team. So if your teammates fight with each other, what would you do? And then Hong said he looked up and then he said, well, I will stop them, tell coaches, and do what the sport coaches asked me to do. And Hong's answer showing the kind of difference to authoritative figures because he'll listen to coaches to tell him what to do and he'll follow. But this answer gets corrected by a sports teacher during a debriefing. The sports teacher told Hong, well, you shouldn't say just follow the order. You need to say something like consult with your teammates, consult with your coaches, and then demonstrate your leadership in your answer. So I think one tricky balance here is Hong's difference or Hong's conformity to authoritative figure is exactly the behaviors that allows him to cultivate his rowing skills and his training, especially in Taiwan's sports training environment. And we can talk later because Taiwan's sports training environment is quite authoritative. But at the same time, Hong was told that he has to cover up these kind of traits during the response to or the paraphrase answers to teachers. And a lot of times I've seen working class students, they are memorizing the paraphrase answers provided by teachers after the mock oral interview practices. And we can talk later about what would be the consequence about that. So one thing Styling class tries to tell is even if you don't really have sufficient cultural capital, even if you don't play violin, even if you don't make eye contact, you are still able to negotiate how you will be perceived in this admission process. But at the same time, there is always almost the cost of it, as those students need to spend more effort to either cover up or to either reconfigure how they are going to present themselves in front of professors. So you may start thinking, okay, so teachers are telling the privileged to sell class. If you're privileged, then sell class. If you're disadvantaged, then sell disadvantage. But what if you have none of them? You're not wealthy enough. You don't have a single parent family like Hong. You're not from an indigenous tribe or something. But at the same time, you're also not poor enough. What would you do? So the final logic I've seen in teachers' advice is what I call selling potential. Selling potential refers to how teachers advise a group of students who either transition between tracks. So this is especially prevalent in Taiwan is sometimes Taiwanese students, they have to choose to apply to engineering or apply to medical school in their second year of high school. Or students who encounter bombs, or students just change their mind to apply to different university and different majors to reassemble trivial and modern experiences into future promises. But potential is a very tricky term, right? When we say potential, at least when I say potential, it refers to the abilities that these people, these candidates will achieve, but might not acquire at present. So this person has potential maybe in the future, but not now. So how do teachers guide students to prove something that they have yet achieved and to negotiate the future value of their behavior. So I'll just use a middle class student's case called Mao Shen, but this logic also applies to both middle class and working class students. So Mao Shen is a middle class. And Mao Shen chose an engineering focus in his second year, so he didn't really have a lot of advanced econ knowledge or civic knowledge compared to other peers who predetermined to apply to econ. But Mao Shen ultimately decided to apply to econ major in the end of college admissions. And he was advised by teachers to pick his grandfather's farming experience as a motivation of his application essay. So he wrote, "My grandfather was a rice farmer working 2 harvest seasons per year, and tasks like transplanting and harvest require higher extra help. And this made me realize the surplus value in econ, and that's why I started to think about being or study econ." And then after that, Mao Shen strategically used his mathematics skills, and he piled these up. And he said, well, with the strong mathematics scores than peers in social science track, because his scores is kind of on average compared to engineering focused peers, but kind of like higher than social science track. I think I can be a really good candidate to study econ in college. So the other dimensions teachers try to advise students to do is try to sell the future promises, but at the same time to avoid oversell without evidence. So what Mao Shen did here is he revealed the limit exposure to social science because he select engineering focus in his second year. And he said, I'm aware I have a basic understanding compared to likely peers, but these are all compiled together is something that I really want to learn agricultural econ. And he ultimately got in. So one of the things in selling potential is a lot of times we think if the privilege just invents in skills, if they play violin, if they learn how to write, they just directly, automatically, and these things and these skills will pay off. But a lot of times, at least in my field work, I see a lot of cases are not like that. Your educational investment will not always almost pay off. And this is where when your life take a turn, or when you just fail, or you just like accidentally choose another major to apply, this is where selling potential logic steps in to speak to the tone of future. So you might start wonder, okay, then this sounds a little bit tricky, a little bit cramming, a little bit strategic, but you are saying that teachers are not professors. They cannot decide whether professors admit students. Does Bridgework actually work? So among 42 cases, most middle class and working class students, they got into mid-tier universities in Taiwan. A few middle class students, they got into elite universities in Taiwan. Some students, working class students, they still remain at the bottom. But we've seen failure cases do exist. So Bridgework do help working class and minority students to have more visibility. But on the other hand, there are failure cases across all middle class and working class students. Okay, so while some bridges remain sturdy, some are shaky and fragile. So Bridgework, on the one hand, Bridgework is the labor-intensive process that teachers are trying to do to eliminate uncertainty faced by students. But on the other hand, Bridgework is the product of uncertainties that faced by teachers as well. Teachers are not professors, so while they try so hard to figure out what a low professor or an up professor would favor, they had a hard time to distinguish the nuanced test between different tiers of professors, like elite professors or mid-tier or other university professors. So there is a case from middle-class students. Teachers told these middle-class students, you just list as many awards as possible as you can in your application essays. But then professors from elite university, they only care about national level awards. This is where the mismatches happens, in which listing many awards might seem not distinct enough. Teachers are not professors, so while they try so hard to predict what questions professors might ask, especially for working class and minority students, in certain cases, when these students go to on-site interview, they got a lot of unexpected questions. So for example, in situations, a teacher asks a student athlete to cover up or try to demonstrate leadership during the on-site interview. The first question student got is how fast you can row. What is your training processes in this process? So from professors' point of view, while students try so hard to demonstrate their memorized answer provided by teachers, from the professor's point of view, there might be inconsistent signals about a particular candidate. Teachers are not professors, so sometimes they think, okay, this evidence should be sufficient to help students to get into engineering school. So they told a lot of candidates who want to apply to engineering school and write something like you plus scratches to indicate their coding skill potential. Is anyone know scratches? No? Okay, so scratches is again that designed for the kindergarten children or elementary schools to kind of like start playing with computers, but it's really not coding. Yeah. So from the engineering professor's point of view, they feel like they've already read so many essays. Everyone say like press scratches, and that's why they want to they try to demonstrate their coding skill. But this is insufficient evidence that lead to oversell cases. So I want to highlight here is these two double-edged sword. On one hand, they try so hard and they do help some students to get into college. They decode the expectations. They help particularly working class and minority students to write essays. Yet on the other hand, we've seen when those translation fails, it reaffirms the boundaries between different universities and different departments in this process in Taiwan's college admissions. So stepping back to think about 3 takeaways here. So the entire Bridgework thing is, the things I'm trying to say here is cultural advantage is not passively inherent. It's not like your parents are all like professors or your parents all play violins or something, artists. You just directly have that advantage. But it's something that you have to actively translate it and sometimes strategically coaches by those culture guys who mediate the process. So in this story, we've seen not only working class students, but also middle class students, they really rely on those culture guides to help them along the way. So the second point here is teachers, not only the entire Bridgework scene, not only parents, but also teachers outsource culture guidance. When not only parents, but teachers, not only the privileged, but the underprivileged outsource culture guidance, when those supporters come into the playing field, it complicates the entire playing field. shifting the shape of inequality from within school inequality to between school inequality. When selective high school, they have more alumni who get into more competitive college to come back to help their current students to get into the more prestigious university. And the final point, I think I've already reiterated that, but a lot of times Bridgework is the kind of ways in which these teachers at the micro setting, they are trying to fine-tune or trying to adapt to the macro level of changes. But it's not through direct adaptation, but through a lot of interpretation, misinterpretation, and speculation in the process. So this is one of my work, and my work contribute to cultural production and inequality, particularly in these entire stories. I'm showing the type of disruptions that might interrupt the transmission of advantage, and what disruptions can be mitigated or not be mitigated by school and class-based resource. And the other thing particularly speak to socialization is that a lot of times we study a single actor, but the entire Bridgework thing shows that we need to study not only parents or teachers, but the interplay between those actors and their supporters about their interventions in the process. And we know higher education expansion after that, still middle-class students are getting to good college. But I'm showing the micro level of sorting and sorting process to see how students individually self-select into a particular major or into a particular university with the help by teachers. So this is one of the work, and I'm actually have some comparisons in terms of how Taiwan system compared to US and China, and happy to talk more about the extensions beyond Taiwan. And I think there are a lot of policy debates right now in terms of how do we reform the system to make it more equal. And a lot of proposal is actually debating in the US as well, like should we make criteria more transparent so that students won't feel uncertain. And there is also policy proposals debated in Korea and Japan. Is like, should we just like go back to exam admissions and like abandon these American ways of holistic screening? And I gave a lot of thoughts, so happy to talk more. Thank you very much. And I look forward to Q&A.
So I've got a couple of questions. So do you expect the changing desirable traits in Taiwan in this college application process as it matures into a more holistic thing over time? And do you expect the admission office to shift from maybe professors of different departments taking on students rather and change maybe to like what maybe Stanford has, which is admission office and for the whole university? And then second question is, do you expect like AI to change the essay process as more essays are posted more into the database, right? Because they can maybe craft it better than whoever's opinion that might be. And then thirdly, as educator, we are always thinking about when we get feedback, in a way, it's changing the trajectory of the thought process of the student. So do you think the students are adapting these things as just a way to get into colleges, or are they really embracing whatever is recommended and really making the changes, embracing whatever that might be, so they make them a better candidate for life?
So thank you for all three fascinating questions. I think the first question is really something interesting, right? Because would it possible in Taiwan to move these admission duties from professors to the admission office? Or, I don't know, because right now a lot of Taiwanese professors, they are complaining it's too much, like, and they don't want to read so many student application essays, they don't want to interview students. So it may be possible, but we can think about the underlying implications there when admissions is controlled by a group of professionals like Stanford's admission office, would that be better for us to select the people that they really want to select? I think that's the question that we can think about. Like, I think if admission is done by those professionals, then maybe there's less uncertainty because they are quite regular and they know how to handle the process. But actually, professors are bad admission gatekeepers. They have too much things to do, so sometimes they can really rely on 5 minutes to pick the next cohort. But at the same time, it may also have some biases in terms of the admission essays. For example, in the US, a lot of times I've heard some scholars, they are studying the underprivileged or DEI. Right now, we cannot say DEI, but they are studying those populations. Yeah, we cannot say that. But they are also have some expectations in mind in terms of how they select minorities, and that also create another things to discuss. The second question, does AI change application process? I think so. So teachers don't have to really like collect that essays hanging on clips when AI have like a much larger database. But I don't know because it's happening right now. I know there are some professors, for professors from Taiwan who are also audience. Maybe we can talk. We can ask their opinions. I think with a larger database, maybe students can rely less speculations from teachers. But at the same time, they also have to filter what information is accurate or not accurate. And I think AI has much more noises compared to teachers. So that's something we can think about. Like if this intervention from AI would things become more equable. The final part, the feedback part, do students actually embrace this kind of advice? I actually have a sample. No sample. So I actually follow students in their second year of college and final year as they transition from education to workforces. And I found especially selling potential cases is very interesting because the students I follow, they didn't really know what they want to do. And then after 4 years, they adopt those narratives and they keep pursuing master degree for the majors they ultimately decide to apply, and some of them become accountant in the end of the process. So I think selling potential is a very interesting cases or typologies in which I see those students initially don't really have like a very clear dreams, and then ultimately through this transition self-sorted into that career. Yeah.
So I'm Pei Zhaolan. I teach sociology at National Taiwan University. So a lot of Ruo-Fan just talk about, I can really relate to that. So I think I have 2 questions. The first one is about the arguments of selling class. I think the talk is very well organized, but I'm less convinced about the first argument of selling classes. Of course, they do sell class, but I think the example you provided are not so much about it. Like for example, like during like interviews, students often casually mention their overseas experiences or their parents are professor, things like that. I think a more solid example of selling class. So I wonder if you can say a bit more about other example. And instead, I think a lot of examples you mentioned about producing disciplinary signals, it's actually go back to the first question we talked about, because I think this is something very unique in Taiwan system, because when students apply, they apply for individual department. So they decide their major upon the time they are admitted. So that is why it is unlikely to have universities admission office to be responsible for the process. So my question is, I think a lot of example you mentioned, how the teacher trying to, repackage the application to suit for individual department. Does that also happen to the other two group students? I mean, the underprivileged and the underprepared. They also have to prepare their package for individual department. So maybe that's actually another logic that cut across these different groups.
Yeah. So I'll first answer your second question. So the three logic I've seen is not like separate from one another. It's more like a typology that try to parcel out what teachers are trying to do based on students' backgrounds. But I agree with you, the tailoring part to match with a particular department and particular university is quite universal across all these cases because they have to apply to the majors and the university at the same time. So a lot of times these tailoring work is really labor intensive process. For example, just like me, I know sociology, but I don't know engineering, right? So this is why they have to go through these labor intensive process. I agree. But based on different groups of students, that tailoring also differs. For example, a lot of sports departments, it's easier for the working class and student athletes to tailor themselves to the sports department, but not engineering department. So the tailoring, the tailoring process is also it also varies based on social origins in terms of how much you can tailor to particular department, and this is where the hidden sorting process that occurs even before they get into college. The first one, selling class. Yeah, students will like mention occasionally or informally like, oh, my parents are professors or I study abroad or something. But does that really sell? I don't think from professor's point of view they like that.
Depends which department.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying here is, for example, maybe some students they apply to business, they might want to demonstrate their international perspective. Oh, I study abroad, so something like that. But sociology, I don't think professor like that. So it really depends on the thing I'm telling is you cannot just sell class. You have to tailor it to different department because different professors they have different tests. Like you can write a long, very lengthy essays to humanities, but then engineering professors or other medical school professors, they don't like that. They want point by point, right? So that's the things I'm trying to tell is like, yeah, you are selling, but at the same time you cannot just say it. You have to kind of like transform it into the signals and that professors like. Yeah. I hope that answers your question, but thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I really enjoyed all the examples that really did and stick to my mind. And I always feel like after this project, you can probably open a consulting company or something to help.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that if I cannot find a job. Maybe I can earn more money than
more research about this, right? Yeah, so like really fascinating. But I have a similar reactions to what PJ has mentioned. Just the first question I have is really a clarification question. So your answer to her question really answers the part about the selling, whether selling is effective or not. But my confusion is coming from the class part, because I wasn't sure, especially in the I think the case that you mentioned regarding the Korean sexual abuse case. I wasn't sure what the how class is reflected in that, part. It's like, is that because he's aware of the privacy issue that's already like a signal of the middle class, or is it has access to all the coaches? But again, the coaches are available to all the students, so it's really like one of the classes rather than selling part, like whether they're selling it effective and not. So that's more of a clarification question. But again, the same question is really about the causal influence. Now looking at the title, I know you're not trying to test the effect.
Causal influence.
Right, it's more like a how, right? But still, because you presented that graph of how many of them are successful, how many of them failed. So I was wondering, like, how do you tease out the kind of like effectiveness of the outcome? To what extent the outcome of the application is attributable to the coaching per se, rather than the student's portfolio overall? Because we only see the coach part, which is other. I wasn't sure how the outcome can be attributed to that. Or the in your word would be the Bridgework.
So in terms of the first question, what exactly is class? I think here, like different people, they have different definitions of class, but I think here what I mentioned is a kind of the languages and the styles and the preferences that overall that we can kind of see from middle class students behaviors. So it's very general in terms of how we use languages, in terms of our embodied gestures, and in terms of all of these things that working class students might not have. But I agree with you, and that's something I'll have to think about, like what exactly the class is if we define the class so in such a broader way, and what exactly is class in this story. I don't know whether that answers your questions or not. In terms of a causal influence, I got these questions a lot from reviewers, and especially quantitative reviewers. So I think one thing I'm trying to parcel out is, of course, we cannot say like the coaching part exactly lead to success in admissions or failures in admissions, right? Because admission process is always a combination of factors in terms of how professors decide their next cohort, or how students compete with one another, or etc., or something like that. But I do have some group comparisons in terms of those who receive coaching versus who do not receive coaching in this process, and those who receive coaching versus those who actually receive less coaching from teachers. They just rely on their peers and friends. Those who receive coaching are more likely to get into the universities they want. And at the same time, because of this triangulation and this Bridgework actually works in, because I'm studying the mediations in this process. So I also do hypothetical interviews with professors from different tiers of universities. So I use the hypothetical examples. I don't give, I use the examples from my field work, and I ask them like, okay, if these students say that, if these students do that, would you give them an admissions or not? It's all hypothetical from my students' real cases, but I'm trying to match. That's why the final part you'll see the mismatches or something. Sometimes some coaching does not work, right? But sometimes some coaching does work. And I found a lot of times coaching does not work well in elite university because they want the systems to be more uncertain. They want students authentic questions. Professors are also knowing that students are prepared with support by those teachers. So they want to see students' authentic selves. They try to make the system and the screening process more uncertain and more distinct, and you cannot easily fake it. But a lot of times those coaching actually works, especially in mid-tier university. So let me clarify. The first question is, do Taiwanese students understand themselves better if we compare the students in China or something? They just rely on their test scores to get into university,
They
right?
know better, so what they want to do, or like their
Yeah.
major or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I feel they are trying to get admission, and at the same time, when they are brainstorming which university and majors they apply, they do have to think through, right? Is this what I want? And during the screening, there was a case in Taiwan, a middle class who's applied to physics, and then who's also applied to sports major, and he got questioned by physics professors, and physics professors asking, well, your all applications are talking about your basketball skills, and why do you want to study physics? I think during this screening process, they are forced to figure out what they want, or at least like what they don't want. Yeah, and that's different consequences or side effect compared to the exam systems in China, which like you get high test scores, you get to the most prestigious universities, and you don't even have room to think through what do you want, right? That's something I kind of see from Taiwanese students, but at the same time, they are also encounter some pressures in figuring out early on. And the second one, how do university help students figure out what they want? I don't know. How do university figure out? I'm not a professor yet. How do professors help students figure out what they want? A lot of times we don't even know what we want, and I don't know. I think allowing flexibility is a way. That's something that Taiwanese university tries to change. It's like you don't have to claim your major the beginning and when you enter into college. Like the US, they are also trying to, they're really liking US system. I don't know why, but they are trying to incorporate that systems, trying to allow students to explore in the first year and then later on decide the majors by themselves. Yeah, there are pros and cons here we can discuss, but I think that's the strategies that Taiwanese universities as a university are trying to do. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I can ask the last question. So, I mean, here you're more looking at students and teacher and professor.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this country, I think it's true in Korea. I think if you have a resource,
mm-hmm.
then you are paying a lot of money to private tutoring or admission, consultants and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that part is kind of missing in your
mm-hmm.
presentation. And then like in this country, I think also in Korea too, if you have resource, you begin to build your resume
mm-hmm.
many years before applying for college. And then I don't know in Korea, I mean here also, if you have a real resource, I don't think they really listen to teachers. I mean, they go out outside to pay a lot of money and pay a lot of private tutoring or consultation. So is that also part of this process, or in Taiwan, it's not much relevant? That's my main question, because when I talk to like a young professor, for example, like a UIC, it's like English speaking program, it's in a very elite program. And then professors saying that it's very hard to distinguish because they all went to private tutoring place. They're coached by the same people, so answers are almost the same. So it's very hard to differentiate one from the other. So I don't know what's in case of Taiwan.
Yeah. So your question is important. You're saying that what's the role in my story about private concerts, right? Do those middle class students, they also get private tutoring or something?
Maybe more important than teachers.
Yeah, which they may offer more accurate advice than teachers. I think I'm portraying a very unique coaching process that is being doing and continuously doing in Taiwan selective high school. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that private counselors do play a role here. So, for example, in Jiaxing's case, she know exactly when to use teachers' labor for free, and then when teachers are overwhelmed by all of these student cases they have to coach, Jiaxing directly hire private tutors. Yeah, so I think that stories kind of plays out in Taiwan in a situations in which the privilege, they know teachers are doing it for free, right? So they use teachers in certain ways, and then when teachers no longer have the energy and time, they pile up with the private counselors and their parents, professor friends or something to get all of these line-up supporters in the college admission process. And that's my next stage next papers to think through the timings in which like activate the coaching or the support by which sectors, because all of these players come to the process to help those people negotiate their advantage. And private concert, I mean, private concert is definitely the part of the stories that I didn't study. So right now, the Crane School in Taiwan, they even transform. They have a lot of advertisement. This is the other thing I've been doing with my collaborator. They have a lot of advertisement and to say, hey, we can coach you how to write your essays, and we can coach you how to get through interviews. Especially in medical school, they have really intense, like 6 sections of interviews. And those Crane School teachers start to figuring out the new ways to advertise and monetize their service in Taiwan. Yeah, so that's the other shadow stories behind the stories I'm telling. Yeah.
So is Jiaxing the one that you mentioned? Was she? Which class was she?
Middle class and
Middle class.
yeah.
So if you want to, like, so you ended the talk with the slide about the importance of inequality.
Mhm.
And I understand the higher class privileged students want to emphasize that sort of signal advantage, and then the ones that are disadvantaged want to signal disadvantage. So I see the class side there, but if the middle class are doing the same thing, have access to teachers, but they're smart enough to access teachers certain ways, and then hire coaches when they need to, and then obviously, again, my guess is the upper class are doing it. I don't know if the working class are not doing it. But the only way that it becomes a mechanism to facilitate inequality is if you have different strategies by different class groups. So maybe the working class don't go to the teachers because they don't have the confidence and they don't have the money to pay for coaches. And so this bridge making, or sorry, but that mechanism is a mechanism to lead to inequality. It was hard to see. So it's not just about pay. In Korea, it's like everybody bypasses teachers and go to private academies that have.
Oh, really? Is
But
that
yeah,
the thing?
But in American context, there's still inequality built into accessing teachers. So there's a lot of studies that show that upper class families' parents are more likely to pressure teachers to help their students, and then working class families don't do that, right? So you can show an inequality mechanism, but it would have to be clear, like a table in your sample to show like this proportion of upper class people have paid for outside coaches, and that this proportion of working classes have not. Then you can clearly see that there's difference in resources, and then that might lead to certain outcomes, and that would kind of emphasize that inequality story.
Yeah.
But if you have Jiaxing in the middle class who's clearly doing the same thing, then it's unclear why class matters at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the stories I'm actually trying to tell is these teachers are trying to help working class and minority students who don't really have access to the private tutoring or something. But at the same time, they also help middle class students. I think the advice I think I like your ideas, and I may have a final roadmap in terms of who leverage which resource to get into the universities. But I think in these stories, teachers are still trying to level the playing field in a certain ways by offering their interventions. And I don't know, but a lot of times I am surprised that Korea students just use private tutors rather than the school teachers. But in Taiwan, I've seen a lot of working class students, they actually heavily rely on those teachers and to get into university because they don't really have other more important resources. Yeah, so yeah, I hope that answers your question. So I think it's part of the stories about teachers try to level the playing field with their limited time, limited resource, and the social contact. So it's kind of equalizing or try to help, but it does not really completely make the system more equal. Like if we want to look at the overall structural patterns, yeah. But that advice is well taken, and I will.
In case this change actually increase inequality, because only those with resource can go to top universities. So
yeah.
Anyway, so I'm interested to see what happens in Taiwan 10 years later for your question. So, but I will say thank you so much. Fascinating presentation and discussion. So.
Thank you.